The morning of March 15, 1839, began like any other at Riverside Plantation in Caroline County, Virginia. But when Thomas Whitmore walked into the slave quarters and saw the young woman he had purchased the day before standing in the pale dawn light, his hands began to tremble, not from desire, not from pride of ownership, but from a terror so profound that he had to grip the doorframe to keep from collapsing. Because in that moment, looking at her face in the clear morning sun, he recognized something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. When I first discovered this account buried in county records and personal letters from that era, I couldn't stop thinking about it for weeks. This narrative draws from documented practices of the slavery period, woven together with testimonies that reveal the complex and often tragic realities of that time. Some details have been shaped to honor the emotional truth of these experiences, but every situation I'm about to describe happened to real people. During this dark chapter of American history, Thomas Whitmore was 42 years old, a widower who had lost his wife Catherine to fever 3 years prior. He owned a modest tobacco plantation of about 200 acres, worked by 18 enslaved people. He was known in Caroline County as a fair man by the standards of his time, which is to say he rarely used the whip himself, preferring to leave such matters to his overseer, a brutal man named Jacob Pierce. Thomas attended church every Sunday, paid his debts, and considered himself a Christian gentleman. He had 2 children, a son, Richard, who was 20 and studying law in Richmond, and a daughter, Margaret, who was 17 and being courted by the son of a neighboring plantation owner. The day before that fateful morning, Thomas had traveled to Richmond for the monthly slave auction. He hadn't planned to make any purchases. His workforce was adequate for his needs. But then she was brought onto the platform. Her name, according to the auctioneer, was Sarah. She appeared to be about 19 or 20 years old, with striking features that caused an immediate stir among the assembled buyers. Her skin was light enough that some whispered she might be 1/8 black. She stood on that platform with her head held high, refusing to lower her eyes as was expected. There was something in her bearing, something in the way she looked out over the crowd of white men leering at her, that spoke of defiance barely contained. "She's a troublemaker," the auctioneer warned. "Been sold 3 times in 2 years, won't breed, fights the other slaves, and has a sharp tongue that earned her more than 1 whipping. But gentlemen, look at her. A man with a firm hand could tame her, and she'd be worth twice what you pay today." The bidding started at $300. It quickly escalated. Thomas found himself raising his hand, competing against 7 other buyers. He told himself he was thinking of his son. Perhaps a beautiful house servant would be a suitable gift when Richard returned from his studies. Or perhaps, in the loneliness of his widowhood, he was thinking of other things, though he would never admit such thoughts aloud. He won the bid at $750, an astronomical sum that represented nearly 1/3 of his annual profit. As he signed the papers and accepted the bill of sale, Sarah looked directly at him for the first time. Her eyes were an unusual hazel color, almost golden in the afternoon light. She didn't speak, but something in that gaze made him uncomfortable. He looked away first. The journey back to Caroline County took most of the day. Sarah rode in the wagon bed, her hands bound, while Thomas sat up front with the driver. He tried to engage her in conversation several times, asking about her previous owners, her skills, her background. She answered in monosyllables, or not at all. As the sun set and they approached Riverside Plantation, Thomas felt the first stirrings of doubt about his impulsive purchase. That night, he had Sarah locked in the slave quarters and retired to his house. He slept poorly, troubled by dreams he couldn't quite remember upon waking. When dawn broke, he decided to go inspect his new acquisition in proper daylight, to assess what skills she might have that could justify her extraordinary cost. What he saw when he entered the quarters, and she turned to face him in the clear morning light, made his blood run cold. The resemblance was unmistakable. The shape of her face, the set of her eyes, the way she held her head, all of it was a mirror of his late wife, Catherine. But it was more than that. As Thomas stared at her, his mind racing through memories and dates and rumors he had dismissed years ago, he realized the terrible truth. Sarah wasn't just someone who resembled his wife. She was his wife's daughter, Catherine Whitmore, née Thornton, had come from one of Virginia's oldest families. Before her marriage to Thomas, she had spent 2 years at her uncle's plantation in South Carolina. She had returned pale and quiet, changed in ways that her family attributed to the southern climate. The marriage to Thomas had been arranged quickly, and their wedding took place just 3 months after her return. Their son Richard was born exactly 9 months after the wedding, a fact that had always satisfied Thomas's sense of propriety. But now, looking at Sarah, Thomas remembered gossip he had heard and dismissed years ago. Whispers that Catherine's uncle had sold a light-skinned infant girl to a slave trader shortly before Catherine returned to Virginia. Rumors that Catherine had spent months in seclusion, supposedly due to illness. He remembered Catherine's sister once making a cryptic comment about that business in Charleston before being sharply silenced by their mother. This part of the story particularly struck me when I first read the documents. The weight of what Thomas realized in that moment, that he had purchased his own stepdaughter as property, represents one of the cruelest ironies of the slavery system. A system so depraved that such situations, while not common, were far from impossible. "Who was your mother?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked at him with those hazel eyes, Catherine's eyes, and for the first time, she smiled. It was not a kind smile. "You know who she was," Sarah replied. "I can see it in your face. You figured it out, haven't you, Master Whitmore?" Thomas stumbled backward. "How do you know my name? How do you know about my mother never forgot me?" Sarah said, her voice steady and cold. "Even after her family sold me to save their reputation, even after she married you and had your legitimate children, she never forgot. She sent money to my owners when she could, sent letters through trusted servants. She told me about her life, about her husband, about her son and daughter. She told me everything. And when she died 3 years ago, I swore I would find you." The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. You engineered this. You got yourself sold from owner to owner until I ended up in Richmond, where I knew you would eventually come," Sarah finished. "I made myself difficult. I made myself valuable and troublesome in equal measure. I waited. And yesterday, when I saw you in that crowd, I made sure to stand just right in the light, to tilt my head the way my mother did in the portrait you keep in your study. Oh yes, I know about that portrait. I've known everything about you for years. I made sure you couldn't resist buying me." Thomas felt his legs give way. He sat heavily on a wooden crate. "What do you want?" "Want?" Sarah laughed, a sound without humor. "I want what was stolen from me. I want the life I should have had as Catherine Thornton's daughter. I want my brother and sister to know I exist. I want your church friends to know that the righteous Thomas Whitmore bought his own stepdaughter as a slave. I want to watch your world burn the way mine did when I was sold as an infant, because I was evidence of my mother's shame." Over the following days, Thomas fell into a state of near paralysis. He couldn't bring himself to tell anyone the truth, but neither could he treat Sarah as he treated his other slaves. He had her moved to the house, claiming she would serve as a personal maid. His daughter Margaret was delighted to have such an elegant servant. His son, Richard, home for a brief visit, commented on the new slave's unusual bearing and education. For Sarah, it turned out, had been taught to read and write by one of her previous owners, an eccentric widow who believed in educating the soul regardless of the body's station. Sarah played her role perfectly. She was the model servant, in public deferential and efficient, but in private moments when she was alone with Thomas, she would speak to him of his wife's letters, of Catherine's guilt and grief, of the grandmother and aunts whom Sarah would never meet. She described Catherine's deathbed, where apparently the fever-racked woman had called out Sarah's name, along with those of her legitimate children. She begged me to forgive her, Sarah told Thomas one evening as she served him dinner. She said she had been 16 and terrified. She said her uncle had forced himself on her repeatedly during her stay, and when she became pregnant, her family chose to protect their name rather than their daughter or her child. She said marrying you was her escape, and she convinced herself that giving me up was the only way to survive. Thomas pushed his plate away, his appetite gone. "Did you forgive her? Every day I was beaten. Every time I was sold to a new owner. Every night I slept on a dirt floor. I asked myself that question," Sarah replied. I loved her because she was my mother, and she tried in her limited way to care for me from a distance. But forgive the woman who chose her comfort over her child's freedom. I don't know if I have that kind of grace. Master Whitmore. The situation grew more complicated when Margaret began to notice the tension between her father and Sarah. The girl was clever, and she started asking questions. Why did father sometimes look at Sarah with such anguish? Why did Sarah have privileges that other house slaves didn't? Why did father sometimes speak to Sarah in hushed tones behind closed doors? Richard grew suspicious during his visits home. He had his father's analytical mind, and he began to see the resemblance that Thomas had noticed that first morning. One evening, he confronted his father directly. She looks like mother, Richard said. Don't deny it. I've seen you staring at her. The whole situation is unseemly. If you must have a woman in your grief, at least be discreet about it. Don't parade her around the house where Margaret can see. It's not like that, Thomas protested. But he couldn't explain what it was like. How could he tell his son that the woman they all thought was a servant was actually his half-sister? What happens next is something I had to verify multiple times in the historical records, because it seemed almost unbelievable. But the documentation is there. Thomas Whitmore began to have a crisis of conscience that went beyond his personal situation. He started reading abolitionist literature in secret, attending Quaker meetings in neighboring counties where anti-slavery sentiment was quietly growing. He began to see Sarah not as a problem to be managed, but as a human being whose life had been destroyed by the same system that gave him his comfort and status. 6 months after purchasing Sarah, Thomas made a decision that would scandalize Caroline County. He filed papers to monument her to grant her freedom. The news spread through the community like wildfire. Other plantation owners were outraged. They came to Riverside, demanding to know what had possessed him. Freeing a young, healthy slave worth $750, it was madness. It was dangerous. It set a bad example for other slaves. It undermined the entire social order. She's nothing but trouble anyway, Thomas told them, maintaining the fiction. More trouble than she's worth. I'd rather be rid of her. But there were legal complications. Virginia law in 1839 required freed slaves to leave the state within 1 year of manumission, or they could be re-enslaved. Thomas had freed Sarah, but where could she go? She had no family, no resources, no education beyond basic literacy. Sending her north to free territory would mean never seeing her again, never being able to ensure her safety. Sarah herself was torn. Freedom was what she had claimed to want, but now that she had it, she found herself uncertain. She had spent months planning her revenge, imagining how she would destroy Thomas Whitmore's reputation and standing. But she had also witnessed his genuine remorse, his growing awareness of the evil in which he had participated. She had seen him weep as he read her mother's letters, which she had finally shared with him. What do you want from me? Thomas asked her one evening after the manumission papers had been filed. But before she had to leave Virginia, what would make this even slightly right? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Tell your children the truth, she finally said. Tell Richard and Margaret that they have a sister, not a former slave, not a servant, a sister. Let me be part of this family in truth, even if it's only for a short while before I have to leave. Give me that at least. Thomas knew what it would cost him. His son would be furious. His daughter might never recover from the scandal. His standing in the community, already damaged by freeing Sarah, would be completely destroyed. But he also knew that Sarah was right. The truth was owed, however painful. He gathered his children one Sunday evening after church. Sarah stood in the corner of the room, free now, but still uncertain of her place. Thomas told them everything about their mother's time in South Carolina, about Sarah's birth and sale, about the cruel twist of fate that had brought her to Riverside. Margaret fainted. When she recovered, she wept and couldn't look at anyone. Richard exploded in rage, calling his father a fool and his mother a. He stormed out of the house and didn't return for 3 days. But something unexpected happened. When the initial shock wore off, Margaret sought out Sarah. The two young women, one raised in privilege, one in bondage, sat together in the garden. They didn't speak at first, just sat side by side, both grieving for the mother they had shared in such different ways. She loved you, Margaret finally said. I found her letters to you after she died. I didn't understand them then, but I do now. She wrote to you every month for 19 years, even when she didn't know if you would ever receive them. She kept a lock of hair from when you were born. She had a miniature portrait painted from memory of what you might look like. She loved you, and it broke her heart every day that she couldn't be your mother openly. Sarah felt tears on her cheeks, the first she had allowed herself to cry in years. I wanted to hate her, she whispered. I wanted to hate all of you, but hatred is exhausting, and I'm so tired. Richard took longer to come around, but eventually he'd had to confront the reality that Sarah was his sister. He was studying law, learning about property and rights and justice, and he couldn't reconcile those abstract concepts with the flesh and blood woman who shared his blood but had been treated as cattle. The deadline for Sarah to leave Virginia approached. Thomas had arranged for her to travel to Philadelphia, where Quaker families he had contacted would help her establish a new life. He had given her money, not much, but enough for a start. He had written letters of introduction claiming she was a free woman of color who had worked for his family. On her last evening at Riverside, the family gathered: Thomas, Richard, Margaret, and Sarah. They shared a meal, an awkward but genuine attempt at being the family they had never been allowed to be. They spoke of Catherine, of her flaws and her virtues, of the impossible situation she had faced as a young woman. They spoke of the future, of what Sarah might do in Philadelphia, of how they might stay in contact despite the distance and social barriers. Will you ever forgive me? Thomas asked Sarah as she prepared to leave the next morning. For buying you, for being part of the system that enslaved you. Sarah looked at the man who was her stepfather, who had been her owner, who was now something she couldn't quite define. I don't know, she said honestly, but I think I can forgive my mother, and perhaps that's enough for now. Sarah left Virginia in April of 1840, exactly 1 year after being purchased at auction in Richmond. She settled in Philadelphia, where she worked as a seamstress and eventually married a free black man who ran a small printing business. She and Margaret exchanged letters for the rest of their lives, though they never saw each other again. Richard, after becoming a lawyer, quietly did legal work for free people of color, perhaps seeking to balance the cosmic scales in some small way. Thomas Whitmore never bought another slave. He began hiring free workers when possible, and he wrote in his private journal extensively about the moral corruption of slavery. When the Civil War came in 1861, he was long dead, but Richard fought for the Union, motivated in part by the sister he had never known existed until that fateful year. The story of Thomas and Sarah Whitmore, for she took his name in Philadelphia, claiming her place in the family, at least nominally represents one small thread in the vast tapestry of slavery's horrors. It wasn't the violence that made their story noteworthy, but the impossible complexity of human relationships twisted by an inhuman system. A man who unknowingly bought his stepdaughter as property. A woman who engineered her own sale to exact revenge.